There's a particular kind of silence that arrives after everyone else's needs have finally been met, a silence that should feel like relief, and instead feels like standing in an empty house you don't remember moving into. The dishes are done. The messages are answered. Everyone who needed something from you today has gotten it, and in that rare, quiet moment, a question surfaces that you've been too busy to ask for years. If I stopped giving right now, who would actually be left standing here? For a disturbing number of people, the honest answer is silence. Not because they don't exist, because somewhere along the way, they stopped checking. This isn't a video about self-care in the way that phrase gets used online. It's about something far more structural, what actually happens to a person's identity when they spend years, sometimes decades, organized entirely around what other people need from them, and how psychology explains both why this happens and what it actually takes to reverse it. Picture someone who has spent the last 15 years as the reliable one, the friend everyone calls first, the employee who says yes before fully hearing the request, the family member who remembers every birthday, smooths every conflict, shows up every single time. From the outside, this person looks generous, admirable, maybe even enviable in their capacity to care. But ask them, privately, what they want, not what they're good at, not what they're needed for, but what they actually want, and something strange happens. There's a pause, sometimes a long one, because the muscle required to answer that question atrophied years ago from lack of use. Carl Jung would have recognized this pause immediately, because he spent much of his career studying exactly this phenomenon, the gradual replacement of an authentic self with a self built entirely to meet external demand. He called the socially adapted mask a person wears the persona, and he warned that the danger was never in having one. Every person needs some version of a public-facing self to function in the world. The danger is in forgetting that a persona was ever a mask at all, and mistaking decades of performance for identity itself. Think about the last time someone asked what you wanted for dinner, or where you wanted to go, or how you actually felt about something. And your first instinct was to ask what everyone else wanted first. That reflex feels like consideration. It feels like kindness. But look closer, and it reveals something else, a person whose default setting has become locating everyone else's preference before locating their own, so consistently that their own preference has started to feel secondary, almost irrelevant, an afterthought to be considered only once the more important business of everyone else has been handled. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable, because that reflex didn't appear randomly. It was built, deliberately and slowly, usually starting long before adulthood. Watch closely, because this pattern rarely announces itself with a single dramatic moment. It accumulates the way sediment builds on a riverbed, invisible day to day. Undeniable only once you finally step back and look at the whole shape it's created. A woman in her 30s might notice she can list, in precise detail, exactly what her partner needs to feel supported. Exactly what her closest friend is going through this month. Exactly what her manager expects from her before it's even asked, and then draw a complete blank when asked what kind of week she's actually having herself. That blank isn't ignorance. It's the direct result of attention that has been pointed outward for so long, so consistently, that turning it inward requires an almost physical effort, like trying to use a muscle that's been asleep for years. Alfred Adler's work offers the clearest starting point for understanding how this pattern takes root. Adler believed that a child's earliest experiences of belonging shape a lifelong template for how they secure love and safety. A child who learns that their needs create friction, that their emotions are inconvenient, or that their value in the family depends on how useful, agreeable, or low maintenance they are, doesn't just adapt temporarily. They build an entire strategy around it, one that gets carried forward, largely unexamined, into every relationship that follows. Giving becomes more than kindness. It becomes the price of admission, the unspoken fee for being allowed to stay close to people at all. But that isn't the real problem. The real problem is what this strategy costs a person once it becomes permanent rather than situational. Something even more dangerous happens beneath the surface of chronic giving, and it has to do with how identity actually forms. Psychological identity isn't static, it's built continuously through a feedback loop of choosing, acting, and noticing the results of those choices. A person who spends years prioritizing everyone else's preferences, everyone else's comfort, everyone else's emotional state interrupts that loop before it can complete. They rarely get the repeated practice of choosing based on their own desire and observing what that desire actually produces. Over time, this isn't just a habit of self-neglect. It becomes a kind of identity erosion, not because the self disappears, but because it never gets the conditions it needs to develop clearly in the first place. And this explains something that confuses so many people who finally do get a moment of freedom, an empty weekend, a quiet house, a period with no one immediately requiring anything from them, and instead of feeling relief, feel disoriented, even anxious. Most people never notice what comes next, because they interpret that anxiety as a personal failing, a sign they don't know how to relax, rather than what it actually is. A self that has been in storage for so long, it no longer knows how to step forward when the space finally opens. Consider what this actually looks like in an ordinary week, because it rarely shows up as a crisis. It shows up as a woman sitting in her car for an extra few minutes after pulling into the driveway, not ready to go inside and resume being needed. It shows up as scrolling through a phone full of messages from people who love her, and feeling, underneath the affection, a low hum of dread at how much of her remains unclaimed by any of them. It shows up as forgetting, genuinely forgetting, what kind of music she used to love, what she used to order without thinking, what a Saturday used to feel like before it belonged to everyone but her. None of this looks dramatic from the outside. That's precisely why it goes unaddressed for so long. There's no single event to point to, only a slow accumulation of a self quietly going unused. This is the point where neuroscience adds an uncomfortable layer of precision to what's happening. Chronic self-neglect in favor of others isn't merely a behavioral pattern, it appears to have a measurable effect on how the brain processes reward. Functional imaging research on people with strong self-sacrificing or people-pleasing tendencies has found altered activity in brain regions associated with self-referential thought. The same regions responsible for constructing a coherent, ongoing sense of who I am over time. When those regions are consistently underused in favor of processing other people's needs and reactions, the internal sense of self doesn't just feel quieter, it becomes structurally less developed, less accessible, harder to locate even when a person actively tries. Something even more dangerous is happening beneath even that, though, because this pattern doesn't just affect a person's internal life. It shapes who they attract and who stays close to them. Evolutionary psychology offers a useful lens here, because human beings evolved in tightly interdependent groups where being useful to others carried enormous survival value. Contribution wasn't optional, it was currency. A person who could reliably meet the group's needs secured belonging, protection, and status within it. This isn't a flaw in human wiring, it's an ancient, deeply functional instinct. The problem is what happens when that instinct is triggered constantly by everyone, without ever being balanced by a corresponding instinct to protect one's own resources. In evolutionary terms, chronic overgiving without replenishment isn't generosity. It's a resource imbalance that, left unchecked, eventually threatens the very survival it was originally meant to secure. Watch closely, because there's a second mechanism compounding all of this. One behavioral psychology explains with uncomfortable precision. Every time a person gives, and that giving is met with gratitude, relief, or approval, the brain logs that exchange as successful. Worth repeating. This creates a powerful reinforcement loop. The more a person gives, the more relational reward they receive, and the more their identity becomes fused with the role of giver, because that role is the one consistently paid off. Over years, this reinforcement becomes so deeply embedded that giving stops feeling like a choice at all. It starts feeling like an obligation the person can't quite explain, only recognize as a discomfort whenever they try to stop. Which raises the real question underneath this entire documentary. If giving constantly is this exhausting, why does the thought of stopping feel even worse? The answer lies in a distinction Viktor Frankl considered central to psychological survival. Frankl, who endured the most extreme deprivation imaginable in Nazi concentration camps, observed that human beings can tolerate almost unbearable circumstances if those circumstances are attached to meaning. For someone who has spent years defining their worth through what they provide to others, giving isn't simply a behavior. It's the primary source of meaning available to them. Stopping doesn't just mean saying no to a request. It means confronting, often for the first time, the terrifying possibility that without something to give, there may be nothing left that feels like a self at all. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable in a different way, because it reframes the entire project. The goal was never to give less out of resentment or exhaustion. The goal is discovering that a self actually exists independently of what it produces for other people. And that discovery, for someone who has never tested it, can feel less like relief and more like standing at the edge of something unfamiliar and quietly frightening. The Stoics understood a related truth, though they arrived at it through different language entirely. Seneca warned that a person who has never learned to attend to their own mind will spend their entire life distracted by everyone else's, mistaking constant motion on behalf of others for a substitute for genuine self-knowledge. Marcus Aurelius, despite ruling an empire whose demands were relentless, insisted on carving out disciplined space each day, purely to examine his own thoughts, treating that internal attention not as indulgence, but as a governing responsibility, no less important than any external duty. Epictetus went further, arguing that a person who has never distinguished between what they owe others and what they owe themselves will inevitably lose track of both, giving so completely outward that nothing remains to give the one relationship that was always theirs alone to maintain. Imagine two women at the exact same stage of life, both having spent years raising children, supporting partners, managing households, showing up for extended family without pause. One reaches a quieter chapter and experiences it as a slow, disorienting grief, not for what she lost, but for a version of herself she can no longer clearly picture, buried under so many years of meeting everyone else's needs first. The other reaches that same quieter chapter and experiences it as an opening uncomfortable at first, but navigable, because somewhere along the way she preserved a thin, consistent thread of attention toward her own interests, her own opinions, her own inner life, even while everything else demanded her focus. The difference between them was never how much either woman loved the people she gave to. It was whether any part of her identity remained hers, untouched, the entire time she was giving. This also explains a pattern that confuses people trying to understand why rebuilding a sense of self feels so much harder than simply deciding to do it. Cognitive psychology shows that self-concept isn't retrieved on command like a memorized fact. It's reconstructed gradually through actual experience trying things, noticing genuine reactions, tolerating the discomfort of not immediately knowing what you like or want. For someone whose identity has been organized around other people for years, this reconstruction can feel maddeningly slow, because there's no shortcut past the actual doing. Reading about self-discovery isn't the same as practicing the specific, small, repeated act of choosing something based purely on your own preference and staying with that choice long enough to see how it feels. There's a particular kind of fear that surfaces the first few times someone attempts this reconstruction, and it deserves to be named plainly, because it stops most people before they've truly begun. It's the fear that whatever gets uncovered beneath all that giving will turn out to be disappointing, smaller, less interesting, less worthy of attention than the role of caretaker ever was. This fear isn't irrational. Years spent defining worth through usefulness to others naturally produce the suspicion that the self underneath might not measure up to the performance. But this fear is almost never confirmed by what actually gets found. What tends to surface instead is simply a person, unremarkable in the way every real person is unremarkable up close, whose preferences and curiosities were never actually gone, only untested for so long that their owner forgot to trust them. There is a quiet kind of relief available once this becomes visible, though, because it reframes what so many people have quietly mistaken for personal failure. The sudden tears during an ordinary, unremarkable afternoon. The strange grief that arrives not from a specific loss, but from an accumulation of years spent unseen by anyone, including yourself. The frightening blankness when asked a simple question like, "What do you actually want?" None of these are signs of brokenness. They are the entirely predictable result of a self that was never abandoned, only deferred, postponed again and again, in favor of everyone whose needs felt more urgent than the quiet, patient, unglamorous work of knowing your own. None of this means abandoning the people who depend on care and generosity. Jung never argued for that kind of retreat, and neither does any serious psychological framework. Interdependence is not the problem. The problem is a version of giving so total that it leaves nothing held in reserve, no interest pursued purely for its own sake, no opinion voiced simply because it's true, no boundary maintained simply because a person has the right to one, independent of whether anyone else approves. Awareness changes this dynamic more than people expect, and it rarely begins with something dramatic. It begins in small, almost invisible moments, noticing the reflexive urge to ask what someone else wants before even considering the question for yourself, and choosing deliberately to sit with your own answer first. Noticing the guilt that surfaces the instant you consider doing something purely because you want to, and recognizing that guilt as an old alarm system rather than an accurate moral signal. Noticing how unfamiliar it feels to simply rest without having earned it through service to someone else, and staying in that unfamiliar feeling long enough for it to become slightly less foreign. It helps to know that this process will not feel linear, and that knowing this in advance can prevent a common discouragement. There will be days the old pattern reasserts itself completely, days spent, once again, anticipating everyone's needs before your own, apologizing for wanting anything at all. This isn't evidence that the work has failed. Jung would likely say it's simply evidence of how long the old pattern had to build before it became automatic, and how much patience its undoing genuinely requires. A pattern installed over decades does not dissolve in weeks, and expecting otherwise only adds a second layer of self-judgment to a process that's already difficult enough on its own. The next realization changes everything, and it's this: finding yourself again was never going to feel like discovering something entirely new. It feels more like excavation, slow, careful, sometimes disorienting work of clearing away years of accumulated obligation to reach something that was never actually gone, only buried beneath everyone else's needs for so long that its outline had grown difficult to trace. The self doesn't have to be built from nothing. It has to be uncovered. Patiently. One honest preference at a time, one small refusal to disappear at a time, until the shape of a person who exists independently of what she provides finally becomes visible again. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this ends. If you stopped giving for just one day, not out of resentment, not out of exhaustion, but simply to see what remained, what do you think you would actually find standing there? And are you willing to find out, even if the answer at first feels like a stranger? If this kind of psychology speaks to something in you, consider staying. There's more waiting beneath the surface, and finding your way back to yourself might just be the most important work you ever do.